Thanks so much. Let's give a round of applause for all the folks running OWASP. Thanks so much for... You guys do an excellent job. I was telling Kyle, the badges are even super cool this year. Don't expect that. So, okay, I'm going to try to do the best I can. Maybe take this thing out. There we go. I'm going to talk a little bit about security operations, some of the lessons that I've learned running security teams. Sorry for the picture right before lunch, but I love tacos. While the original idiom is probably a little bit more appropriate, I didn't feel like putting that up on your screen, so sorry, not sorry. And you know what, due to the amount of tactical diplomacy and cat herding involved in the job that I did, this would also be a appropriate, appropriate title for this talk. I actually came up with 5 different titles this morning in the shower, but I realized I should probably stop, and they're actually pretty good titles to be used. Also a disclaimer, this is a story of transformation, so naturally there's going to be some humble, not so graceful beginnings. But much like a proper post-mortem in an incident, this is going to be blameless, not meant to cast anyone in a bad light. So let's start with the shit talking, starting with me. Who am I? Why am I up here talking to you? I'm certainly not as famous as Adrian or Dan or Marcus we saw yesterday. So while I do hate talking about myself, I feel like I should explain why I'm up here talking to you. My name is Garrett Gross, as Kate said. I'm the Senior Director of Technical Sales at Huntress, where I head up the organization that contains sales engineering and a couple of other skunkworks projects we have in the mix. I can consider myself a lifelong hacker, career security researcher, but when I started out, I called myself a penetration tester. I'm sure, as a lot of you know, that entailed me finding a bunch of things that you don't want me to find and writing up a nice report of what I found so you can address them. More of a creative writing gig, if you ask me. There's actually a lot of different areas in penetration testing that you can specialize in. I specialize in initial access, things like reconnaissance, stuff like that. So using information on the internet people put out there, even back then, was way too much. Nowadays, it's crazy. Social engineering, I think a couple other speakers have talked about that, getting people to do things that they normally wouldn't do, like enumerate an entire IT stack over the phone with someone you just met. And of course, writing exploits for vulnerabilities in servers, networks, phones, cameras, whatever. Certainly done some shady stuff in the past that we just won't have enough time to get to today. But I've learned that crime does not pay, as well as security software. But really, I use my past experience to understand the motivations of those that want to do you harm. So I know that if I were running attack campaigns today, I would target folks with the least amount of resources, those that don't have the ability to defend themselves. Working backwards, I target folks that think they have the resources to defend themselves, and when I am successful, they usually have the most to lose, so more susceptible to things like extortion. In tandem, I try to do all this in the least amount of time, producing the least amount of noise, and maximize my time on net to produce the largest effect. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to put myself out as the most lead hacker. Certainly not today. I'm like a script kiddie at this point. But I am an expert on the motivations of those that want to do you harm. And throughout my career, I've got landed some pretty cool jobs. First job was a network engineer at a small Cisco shop in the Las Vegas area. Right around the time everyone was networking all the things. Had access to some pretty cool areas that probably not a lot of folks have. It's pretty cool. Since then, done loads of security research, been a sysadmin, worked in tech support. I was a sales engineer. I suppose I still am a sales engineer. Advised some product teams at several security vendors where I met Kate. I was the principal engineer on Palo Alto's security team for about a month. Buy me a beer and I'll tell you that story. That's not even really a cool story. I just like free beer. But most recently, what I'm here to talk to you about today is I built and ran a security operations center for a decent-sized global software company. I have tried out for the Blue Man Group, but legally I can't say anything more about that. So now that we've gotten to know each other a little bit better, let's talk about the current state of security. It's not good. Really, though, we're still seeing trends that indicate that things are just not getting better. For instance, 82%. Over 4 out of 5 breaches involved users doing things that we shouldn't. So whether that's us giving up our credentials, clicking a link in a phishing email, doing shady stuff on company assets, or simply making mistakes, we still play a large role in incidents and breaches alike. And the pessimist in you might say, oh, well, you can't fix stupid. Stupid is forever. I think that's Ron White, actually. But I see it as a really huge opportunity for us to intervene in a large amount of breaches just by leading with education. That's about all the feel good you're going to get, by the way. This isn't a Tony Robbins talk. Let's talk about attack complexity. So the vast majority of attacks that we see out there include only a handful of steps, 3 in fact. Phishing, initial access, and malware deployment, usually ransomware, or saw a lot of crypto miners too. That's what comprises the majority of attacks, with very few leveraging more than 5 or more actions. Well, our job as defenders is to lengthen that attack chain, not only to give us more time to respond and hopefully recover, but attackers tend to give up or even avoid scenarios where the longer attack chain will keep them more exposed. Let's talk about ransomware, everyone's favorite. Certainly not slowing down. In fact, ransomware increased 13% over the previous year, which is a jump greater than the last 5 years combined, which is hilarious because that's what I feel we always say when we talk about ransomware. It's just always this exponential rise in activity. Well, why is that important? Why is that significant? Well, because with ransomware, threat actors don't have to spend as much time on your environment. They spend way less time in reconnaissance looking for key assets because that's usually not the goal. Typically, you just need a single entry point, someone clicking a link in an email, opening a file, something. And with how most modern ransomware campaigns go down, as long as you have that, you can own at least one machine, maybe spread to others, which would obviously be better, or worse, depending on who you are. Encrypt the data and steal it. You can interrupt business, you can get folks' attention, and move very quickly to extortion. Hell, ransomware groups don't even have to have in-house development anymore. Ransomware as a service has been a thing, it's been around forever. You don't have to really even know how to code, like me. Anyone with money, motivation, the ability to transact on the dark web can run a pretty effective ransom campaign. But you might say, oh, but you still need to be able to get in, target people with phishing emails, socially engineer them to give out their credentials, maintain a network of C2 servers and shady financial components so you can get paid and not get caught. But to that, I'd say you're dead wrong. Every single one of those that I mentioned has actually been commoditized right now. And not only are there dark web marketplaces where you can buy all this stuff, but they have like customer testimonials, about us sections. Don't believe me? 100%. Hey, look at us. We're just a team of enterprising young cybersecurity enthusiasts helping you to be a menace to society. And I mean, I can't knock the hustle, and as much folks, or as much trouble as these folks have caused me, I get it. It's just like the complete lack of awareness that I just don't get. Whatever. So what does all this mean? Why am I showing all this fear, uncertainty, and doubt? Well, it takes up 10 minutes of my presentation, but it also tells you that attacks are happening way more often. They require less manual steps, less technical prowess, and operate more like a spray and pray attack, so way less targeting. And from one of the studies that I'm referencing, the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, which you should read every single year. If you don't have time to read it, they produce a nice executive summary. Verizon will take your check, thank you. In that study, they found that the number 1 and number 2 motivations behind attacks were financial and espionage related. But I'd counter that, the espionage is probably just to further some plot for financial gain. You can always follow the money, right? But that's it's its own talk. But to show you how much money is in it, in 2020, the average initial ransom demand was almost $500,000 with a top ransom demand of $3 million. So fast forward a year, 12 months, and it jumped to, any guesses? Anybody? No? More than quadrupled to an average of $2.2 million with a ceiling of almost $5.5 million. And these stats, by the way, these are no secret to those in the know. In fact, threat actors love to brag. If anyone's familiar with GandCrab, anyone familiar with GandCrab? Very famous for netting themselves over $2 billion in the course of a year. For all you non-math nerds, that is $2.5 million a week. And they're very famous for when they retired, they sent out a really nasty note to rub all our faces in it. And they said something like, we've proven you can do evil without retribution. Just a real real asshole thing to say after they rob you for all that money. So I think it's safe to say this is not going to go away. This is not going to fix itself on its own. And as Dan pointed out, guess what else won't go away? Supply chain issues. Breaches from Kaseya. We don't talk about that one a lot. Near enough. SolarWinds, Log4j, like Dan talked about a lot. They remind us that these third-party systems that we depend on are just as likely an attack vector as our own environment. And these days, every company, every industry relies on some sort of internet-connected technology or IoT device to function or at the very least compete. Can anyone here think of an example where a job doesn't use technology at all? I love being stumped. Babysitting. Keep track of your time. How are you going to get paid? You use a mobile app. They have mobile babysitting apps, and the babysitters that you want to use are probably using some kind of trust verification, crowdsourcing reputation. Spoiler alert: there are no jobs that use it. The closest I've gotten was someone said an actor portraying a blacksmith in the field in colonial Williamsburg, and I was like, that's really good. But even then, I give that person 2 weeks before they see that their direct deposit didn't hit, and they're like, I think I'm going to go back to Hot Topic now. So think about your organization. Think about your own reliance on this technology, the software, and then think about the access that you give to this technology and how that could be used against you. Not a pretty thought, right? So what do we do about it? How do you defend against a team of hyper-vigilant, well-funded, non-discriminatory, team of jerks? Well, you hire this guy. And if he's not available, you have to build a security operations team comprised of folks doing some of the things that you see up here on the screen. But that's not even really a good answer because, like anything, you can make security operations as complex or as simple as you like. Even then, where do you start? Even if you try to tackle the first four, which some would argue are table stakes, those alone could be daunting for a well-rounded security operations team to plan out, deploy new initiatives every 3 months or so, maintain operational status of those initiatives, and defend against all the people that are trying to kick your door down every day. And I know this because that's exactly what I did. And while we were pretty capable, but certainly well-funded, it was not a walk in the park. Not at all. And I would say it was touch and go at times. So if it's that difficult for what I would consider an enterprise-grade team, making up maybe 1% of the teams that we see out there, what about the other 99%? How do they even stand a chance? Well, let's take a closer look at the differences between these two teams. Let's take a look at the security operations center of your dreams versus what we're mostly saddled with. First up, life in the 1%. Specialized team to cover shifts, usually 24/7, dual layered. If Bob has to take a mental health day, Nancy can take over. You've got specialized folks, manager, engineer, analyst. You got people that can focus solely on incident response, solely on threat hunting. You got people running project management. You can just keep adding people here. Pen testers, malware analysts, baristas, whatever. The team is very well funded. In fact, you're scrambling to spend budget by the end of the year. And all of this is driven by policy that has been created well before you arrived and is maintained elsewhere. And all security action is flowing through this team. And they're the ones effectively driving security awareness for the company. And by the way, likely part of a greater security utopia. So other fleshed out areas within security architecture, governance, risk, compliance, stuff like that. And keep in mind, these teams exist. I've worked on them, but it's just not attainable or even reasonable for anyone outside the largest corporations of the world or the U.S. military to plan or maintain anything close to this. This is millions in salaried employees alone. The more likely scenario is glorified guerrilla warfare, where we're just kind of reacting all the time. Limited staff, likely not enough people to cover 24/7. You're having to augment yourself by leveraging managed services. No one is specialized. Everyone's wearing several hats. Jack of all trades. Is sounding familiar to anyone? I mean, I worked on these teams too, so I get it. Little to no funding. You're always having to justify your existence. And always having to fight for attention and influence, because even if you are well-funded, getting people to listen to you or enforce your policies is still very, very tough. I would even say a likely scenario is that your budget is going to be lumped in with IT, so even then you're having to convince other technically savvy folks that you're more important, which you are, trust me. Policy, if it exists, it's either lacking in specificity, or it's not updated, so it's not usable. And then this team is security, meaning if it doesn't come from this team, it's not happening. The buck stops there. So again, you find yourself really only fighting fires and reacting all the time. And if not properly managed, you'll never evolve past that. So let's get to the meat of the presentation. We'll talk about a little bit about my journey. I'll set the stage a little bit. A good friend of mine reached out to me and said, hey, my buddy, he sounds nothing like that. I don't know why I just did that. Hey, my buddy and I just joined a company. We need someone to build security from the ground up. So I was like, okay. Coming from the startup world, I imagine like 7 folks in a broom closet talking about, trust relationships. But the reality was much more interesting. What they had actually joined was a 15-year-old, several $100 million a year global software company in a turnaround phase. I'm trying to look in the room to see if there's anyone from that company here feverishly. They're making key investments at this time to reinvent the business. And one of those key investments was security. And I was told that it needed some work. Boy, did it. What I walked into was what some would describe as a dumpster fire. We had a security executive who was writing policy. I really don't know what else he was doing. Maybe answering sales questionnaires, a lot of those. We had IT handling security with 2 dedicated people covering about 1,500 employees across 20 physical offices, over 10,000 endpoints across those offices, remote work, data center, cloud. DevOps ran their own security. I'll talk about that in a sec. There wasn't much in the way of security process, that was my point. There was this weird adherence to change management, though, which made other things very difficult. There was also no security technology. Well, little technology. There was basic endpoint detection and response. There was a SIM that was highly neglected, not really curated or kept up. There was some vuln scanning. And I do give these teams grief, but they were actually running some ops. Like I said, vuln assessment, monitoring some cloud logs for events. Great team, super talented, just as you'll see thematically, just not a lot of love from above. So some of the other initial challenges, we didn't really have functional incident response in my opinion. There was no incident response team defined. Now, I need to be careful what I say here. There was a team of like security roles and then who on the C-level they would call when the shit hit the fan, but there wasn't like an incident commander, deputy, scribe, liaisons laid out. No formal process that I felt would actually be useful. And it hadn't really been tested. I mean, it had been tested annually, to adhere to external culpability, but just hadn't been tested in like tabletops and stuff that I would recommend were effective. There was no centralized control of infrastructure, which was really taxing. This was due to past M&A never really getting finished, but also just it was an engineering-led organization, so there are new development environments popping up all the time without our purview, and we just kept finding stuff. I mean, just all the time. Managed network. This was a new one for me. This made network introspection absolutely impossible. I mean, we had visibility, but really to do anything, was like a 24-hour delay. And I don't want to say that they are bilking the company because I don't want them to sue me, but they were providing least effort at a premium price, and the time zone delay certainly didn't help. So, managed networks, your mileage may vary. As I mentioned, engineering kind of did what they please. They broke themselves up into cloistered groups that they called tribes, their words, replete with warfare and everything. Some tribes were great. Some were developing with security in mind. Some were exposing Postgres databases to the internet. So it was a very wide swath of considerations of security. At first, I just thought this was a product of bad M&A hygiene. But then I was like, wait a minute, maybe this is deliberate. Maybe it allows this malleability and they all get to act as startups. But then I realized, much like everything else, it was just a lack of curation, planning, and investment. And as an aside, in a highly mature org, not them, this probably would have worked. Kind of have that incubator type setup, which is pretty cool. Last one we'll talk about here. Onboarding and offboarding was also in transition, which is great because that was another significant investment that was being made in the company, but it was being run tandem with a lot of other improvements like myself. So it was like a general contractor scheduling all the builders in different, various areas to show up at once, and we just ended up tripping all over one another. And I don't want to get into specifics because we'll be here all day, but I cause a lot of problems when trying to track user activity when the user record is updated constantly. Oh, right. There was some history with our leadership team. What I failed to mention earlier was that the buddy of my friend was actually the former CEO of a largish software company who had been through arguably one of the more grueling public breaches in recent history. One of the main themes in his latest venture was security, as I'm sure he didn't want to testify in front of Congress again, so let's just say all eyes are on me. And I went into this with the best intentions, came up with the 30, 60, 90-day plan. I was going to meet everyone strategically, carefully, methodically, pour through everything, but just realized very quickly that I had no idea what I was doing. That's not true. Blissful ignorance probably would have been easier to explain. I did know what I was doing, but I had no idea what I got myself into. So my reapproach, after lots of crying, was to scrap my 30, 60, 90-day plan and address things in the following order. Get initial visibility, develop a team, identify existing security controls, then start looking at policy, process, and procedure, but from a strategic standpoint, look at things like incident response, vulnerability management, acceptable use, stuff like that. And then moving forward, I'm going to have to define security's long-term strategy and communicate externally what we're doing. So digging into that, let's talk about what I did in regard to visibility. But first, let's talk about this is what happens when marketing doesn't get involved in my slides. I made some joke about visibility and large font. I don't know. We're going to go with it. So to get better visibility, I identified key assets and then hardened them. So things like assets where sensitive data is stored, identity providers, domain controllers, stuff like that. Any assets owned by VIPs, hardened the operating system, added them to a little extra scrutiny. When we started deploying detection and response tools, they'd be added to like watch lists and stuff like that, but just add a little bit more visibility onto things that we felt would be more highly targeted. We got EDR everywhere. Endpoint detection and response, by the way. I walked into an existing relationship with a vendor, so I didn't get to choose who we used, but I mean, in this case, even Windows Defender would have been acceptable. In fact, some would argue that Windows Defender is better than a lot of paid-for options, but again, probably its own talk. We put EDR everywhere. I mean, everywhere that touched the internet. Was that the right approach? The EDR vendor would probably say so. The dev team, not so much, and we'll talk about that later. But up next, I got an understanding of what vulnerability assessments have been done in the past, where we needed intelligence, looked at past penetration tests, any plans that we had for product certifications or any regulatory compliance, stuff like that. And then while it wasn't in my purview, I had to understand the current status of product security because we develop software. So current controls that they were using, tooling they were using, assessments, how they're jacked into the SDLC, stuff like that. Next up, people. And this includes not only security operations assets, but also the other folks in our company. So first up was to assemble a tiger team of experienced engineers. And this was pre-negotiated, so you may not want to just walk in every job and say, I'm hiring 4 people. But I knew because of the mission at hand, I knew I had to have folks on the ground immediately. So that was absolutely pre-negotiated and vital to my success. I then drafted an org structure, and yes, this helped me understand where gaps were, but it also allowed me to avoid the many hats problem. So I had a kind of a visual representation of as responsibilities and roles were stacking up, that was kind of my clue to start hiring more. I then started forming or meeting key people across the org as soon as possible. I think forming good, authentic relationships with people across your organization is as important as getting the security right. And when I first started doing this, candidly, I thought I was being a little bit political. But then I realized that I was just prioritizing the perspectives of those around me, and I'd find things out like, how has security made your job harder? What security improvements do you think would make your job easier? What security things do you hate because they weren't properly explained? Stuff like that. And I was able to get ahead of problems, in a lot of cases solve them before they even got to be a real issue. And it wasn't disingenuous. It was truly meant to be mutually beneficial. I'd include these folks in future decisions, get their feedback, and tried to give them a real voice in the direction of security. And this is mostly involved with like the development leaders and how my controls were going to interact with their future plans for product development. This is a really important one. I started company-wide comms on security because no one was really talking about security. And I'm talking about leading with education, not fear, uncertainty, and doubt like I led this presentation with, not reprimand. Things like, as you're rolling out EDR, what is EDR? Why should you not hate it? What is it doing? What is it not doing? We're not reading your emails. The people in IT are reading your emails. This is totally different. Maybe you're under a lot of smishing attacks, SMS-based phishing, and you say, hey, I understand the CEO has been contacting you for Applebee's gift cards. Let's talk about that. And what that does is that proactively starts getting people to talk about security. It increases uptake of security. Again, it promotes that kind of corporate responsibility, which, as a quasi-anarchist, I really don't care about that. But at the same time, you want people to, take some ownership of what they're doing. And that's a really great way to start talking about security and get them involved. Next up, understanding access at the company. So again, I kind of walked in way late in the game. So I need to understand what were the access levels? How were they provisioned? Who has all the admins? How do you treat local machine access? Stuff like that. We actually did a complete enumeration of every single freaking identity account we had across our identity provider, across cloud accounts. Yes, this sucked, but it was awesome. It was completely necessary, and we found out stuff. Definitely can't get into details there, but like identity containers that were in different languages, nested identity containers that provided really weird trust relationships. So again, just going through and enumerating every single account and taking a look at that was what we had to do. I'm sure there's software out there that does that, but we certainly didn't have the time or the know-how. We also wanted to try to do a complete enumeration of every application used, but that's very, very difficult, as I found out. If you don't have like a secure access service edge or something like a web gateway that's actually filtering everything. There are tools out there that do this. In fact, a friend of mine launched a company. He didn't pay me, so I'm not going to mention the name of the company, but it'll use things like metadata in your email to mine for emails from cloud account signups to kind of infer what you're using. Pretty cool. Last but not least, on the people front, security training. But not only are you doing it, but how good is it? How often are you doing it? Is this a check the box type activity, or are you actually trying to get people engaged? Any guesses as to which way it was going with this corporation? Yeah, your words, not mine. Moving on, I needed to identify what controls were in use, and I used my trusty friend, the NIST CSF. Again, its own talk. But we can use this by going around the circle to talk about our current security stack. So the ability to identify what's out there. Dan talked about this with attack surface management, asset intelligence, even vulnerability assessment. But then how are we protecting ourselves with things like antivirus, firewalls, SSO, MFA, single sign-on, stuff like that. Forget I'm talking to a group of DevOps folks. Disk encryption. But also, what are we using to detect threats? EDR, XDR, FDR, whatever we're calling it these days. SIM, IDS. What are we using to respond to attacks? And not only controls that we have on the endpoints, like network isolation, but what are we using for incident response? How are people reporting incidents? How are you tracking them? How are you talking about them? How are you documenting them after the fact? And then also, what automated responses are in play? And then finally, how can you recover from the attack in the way of backups? Not only do you have them, but are they validated and tested? Do you have business continuity and disaster recovery plans? Are those validated and tested with real world scenarios like tabletop exercises? Do you have a cyber insurer? Do you think they'll actually pay out based on how you have your stack set up? So the point of this is I would make a running list of controls I found next to the cybersecurity framework and use that to guide my efforts and prioritize what I was doing moving forward. Then after looked at the security controls, I had to look at improving our security policies, process, and procedures. And like I said earlier on, this is something that I thought I would kind of do at the onset, but I found myself doing this pretty much midstream, or what I would consider late to the game. But looking at things like our incident response plan. Like I said, how are incidents reported? Who is responding? What's the SLA on that? How are we communicating about these events? Vulnerability management standard. There's actually no SLA on addressing vulns when I showed up, so I guess it was like a best effort, at addressing these things. A quick win here was actually to put a 24-hour response time on any critical incidents, and which is nice, is that you can abstract the severity definition in another reference document or something like that. So it doesn't really put you in a weird position, but it does institute anything classified as critical, respond in 24 hours. Acceptable use policy, we actually had nothing around what you could use your machine for or not for, except for business purpose, which, I mean, we had fun defining different business purposes around the security team. Past leadership had taken a much more lax approach, so that set a pretty difficult standard to navigate. And then finally, our information security standard. While there were no hard requirements around auth, password length, complexity, stuff like that, most folks were policing themselves pretty well. Next up, I had to define our vision moving forward. So first, I want to make sure that we knew what the primary purpose of security operations was. So we were responding to incidents, we were detecting and hunting for threats, and we scanned for vulnerabilities and reported on what we found. But we also need to make sure that we assess the infrastructure in a way that didn't disrupt the business. When we communicated our findings to our stakeholders, we made sure that what we communicated made sense. So giving them examples of why this is an issue, giving an example of what good or what fix looks like, speaking their language and meeting them where they are. And a good example of this is, don't make developers log into your fucking security tools with the dark UI. Like no one wants to use that. If there's ways to trigger action from like their build automation platforms with, good examples like Jenkins triggering off, DAS scans and a DAS scan or something like that, do that. I found that to be much more effective than trying to get them to work in my tools and remediate from there. So moving on, need to reassess my initial objectives, just make sure that they still applied. I was hired to stop the bleeding, check, set up a team, check, build a security stack, check, and expand my security purview. It was in progress. So it looked like we're still moving ahead, but how do I define success moving forward now that I kind of have my initial objectives outlined? Well, one way to help you figure that out is to communicate your progress externally. Not only does that help you track your own efforts, but also just make sure that you are aligned with your peers, management, execs, stuff like that. And if you want my advice on defining success, it would be to start small and iterate. So instead of a complete rollout of EDR, 100%, work population by population. I actually made that mistake and had this concept of 100% rollout looming over my head for a period of several months, and that was not fun. Another example would be instead of saying, hey, I'm going to reduce risk, roll it out in phases where you're starting with demonstrating the ability to collect the right data to show your risk, and then figure out the best way to demonstrate your reduction of risk, and then actually move to reducing the risk itself. Point being, this phased approach allows you, like I said, to demonstrate progress internally and externally, as well as providing opportunities to check your alignment. So then, moving forward, how do I evolve security? I had a lot of thoughts here. I don't want to spend a lot of time, but I wanted to centralize incident response across not only security issues, but also financial issues, disaster issues. Things that with the pandemic in full swing. We were thinking about things like that. We wanted to centralize infrastructure management. I talked about this earlier, but provide more of a catalog-based approach to where you weren't rolling your own infrastructure. And then a common theme that we wanted to roll out was just more automation. And I'm not a developer, obviously, but so I'm not a fan of leading with automation because that's just not what I do. But when we found ourselves just doing the same thing over and over again, that was my cue to maybe go learn something new, brush up on my Python. A good example of that would be validation of intent. Like a lot of times we'd find something on a client endpoint, and because we were developing software that oftentimes looked like malware or an attack, I'd have to Slack out to these folks and say, hey, is this you running malware.exe? Yeah, don't worry, it's me. And then that's fine. Flag it as a false positive. Go update our intelligence. But if it's not, that's game on. Well, what if we could set up a Slack bot that would just go out there, Slack them, present them with a yes or no box and say, is this you or not? That would just speed up our process and, again, get us to a quicker resolution. So moving on, this process of deploying security to this company was not easy. Several roadblocks presented themselves, but even before we got to security itself, hiring, what a challenge that is. We're, like I said earlier, pretty well funded. We still struggle to find people due to the very large number of jobs out there in security. We had a large amount of unqualified applicants. Here I recommend working with a recruiter, and if you're trying to decide between internal or external, pros and cons. External recruiters can be a lifesaver. You can also find yourself paying a lot of money for a hot garbage recruiter. So then you may say, well, let's move to an internal recruiter, but that's just compounding the problem. That's like hiring someone to help you hire people. So it just prolongs that. My advice would be augment staff with outsourcing, but just be prepared to pay through the nose. Cheap talent's not worth it. Whole adage of buy once, cry once kind of comes into play here. We also worked against a general distrust of security, and I'll admit we came in a little hot because we kind of opened up the doors and we're like, what the fuck are you guys doing? So naturally folks saw us as an impediment. Like we were telling them how to do their jobs, and I understand that, but instead of fixing things, they would just spend a lot of time poking holes in our process and in our technology. The fix there is actually to have discussions that talk about a broader impact, and a lot of security people for some reason think that their audiences are not technical, but again, that's its own talk. But I would recommend talking about things in terms of impact and how RDP kind of ruins it for everyone, not just the security team. We also had a complete lack of security awareness, which is probably related to my prior point. And again, not sure how much detail I want to go into because we'll be here forever, but some of the things that people did had me questioning on like whether you're getting paid to work against me. A lot of repeated offenses from the same people, a lot of low-hanging fruit. Another obstacle, and again, blameless here, not trying to just talk trash, terrible IT architecture. I mean, just again, not their fault, just a complete lack of investment from the higher-ups, and don't want to go into detail there. And then lastly, R&D. I know I just bag on R&D. This just should be the bag on R&D talk, but like I'd say 9 times out of 10 when we get a box popped, it was R&D. And it was stuff for like default creds on applications, outdated versions of software, again, Postgres exposed to the internet. Can anyone give me a good reason for just exposing Postgres to the internet? Because I can write a book. I've gotten every reason under the sun for that. They had no consideration of secure networking, and I don't really expect them to, but there's no questions our way asking, how can we set this up initially? And then the last point with R&D is that anyone could create infrastructure at one point. We had rogue cloud accounts. I don't want to go into detail, but we had one cloud account that was expanding without our control at one point. It was horrible. But one of the most infuriating struggles that I like to talk about is security vendors. And I know I work for one, but I'd like to say that we're outside of this population. This is the current security vendor landscape of, I think it's 2021. Momentum, they do a great job of updating this every year. But I'd say that in addition to just the blinding and dizzying amount of vendors out there, I'd say most vendors are not set up with the customer in mind, which sounds counterintuitive, but think about it. Support sucks. Documentation sucks. If your product has to integrate with something else, the support and the documentation of that probably suck. And it's not because people in support suck. Like I said, I was in support for a very long time. It's just this myopic, kind of throw it over the fence type approach that you see a lot, which again, doesn't help out folks like myself. Also, a lot of these corporations are very salesy, and again, I work in the sales organization of a security software vendor, but that I feel like that's why I'm here. I'm like the man on the inside, working my way out. But what I found with a lot of vendors is that regardless of my specific problems, my aspirations of what I wanted to do with security and mated with my capabilities, I found that their product was always going to be the right solution for me. Which, by the way, just makes bad customers. Because even if you do trick me into buying your product, I'm just going to make your life a living hell. And the other thing is I don't pretend to know everything. In fact, I think I've gained a lot of success by knowing that I know very little. So when I'm trying to solve a new problem and learn something new, like cloud workload protection or securing Kubernetes, I can't even say it, Kubernetes, something like that, I'm met with a bunch of BS marketing convincing me that their solution is the best way, rather than leading with education and kind of coming to this decision together as to whether or not that's going to solve problems. But again, that's its own talk. I'll quit bagging on security vendors. Let's shift gears. Let's talk about some of the quick wins, some of the things that put us in a much better position security-wise, but also helped us build momentum. Momentum that I think is necessary for any initiative, but especially security to get off the ground. So SSO and MFA, single sign-on, multi-factor authentication. This is by far the best thing you can ever do for your organization. Relatively, it is the easiest to roll out. It is the least expensive in my experience, and it netted us the most protection of credential abuse out there. In fact, my former boss had a policy of like, if we hadn't rolled out MFA company-wide, we're not doing anything else, and we only did that for a period of a couple weeks. It's great. I mentioned EDR, talk about that a lot. I'm a big fan of EDR. It saved our butts a lot. But when you couple that with auto provisioning, using like a mobile device management solution, or like a custom cloud automation, we built some harness, elvish magic container thing that would automatically inject our EDR agent onto any instance that was created. So any infrastructure that we would create would automatically be added to our security purview, which was awesome. Aggregating control of infrastructure. So again, I talked about this a lot. We had a bunch of different groups managing their own infrastructure. And we had official environments, by the way. We just had other people who were just like, I'm going to do my own thing. I actually had finance help me out with this. A quick win here was to, and this was not my idea. I can't name her name, but my homegrown finance. She said, well, why don't I just start declining all expense reports that have any kind of cloud services in them, and I'll say to come see you before I approve them. And that stopped that real quick, because again, that was going against policy. It's not like I was just being a jerk, but the shutting the sieve off of the reimbursing you for your probably large cloud account, that had a great effect. A lot of conversations that were very positive netted from that. Predefined security and cloud services. I talked about this earlier, but things like using known good images, menu-based security groups, stuff like that. Incident response tabletops. This is a huge one. This is the best training that I feel a security team can do. This puts you in a much better position of how to respond, how to anticipate changes to your environment, stuff like that. And also, it can be really fun. Even if you don't know much about IR, there's a team, Black Hills Security. I was wearing their hoodie earlier, not a paid shill, but they put out a game called Backdoors and Breaches. Anyone here heard of Backdoors and Breaches? It's awesome. It's a card-based game that simulates an incident response. And, it's chance-based and stuff like that, but really fun, kind of gets you talking about it. And if you don't want to pay for the decks, they actually put them out on the internet for free. So win for Black Hills. Finally here, Agile. Not a developer. This was something that was very, very different for me. But we had someone on the team that knew Agile, and she was a Scrum Master. So this helped us be a lot more predictable in our efforts. The external, communication of what we were doing became much more effective when we communicated in this fashion. But my advice here, and I know I'm talking to a room of devs, but if you're not familiar with Agile, don't do this. It will actually absolutely add as an impediment if you're trying to figure this out while also trying to figure out your job. So some other lessons learned. We talk about this a lot. People, process, technology. It's, in my opinion, laid out that way for a reason, because I figure that the first place to invest is in people and hiring the right people. That also could be its own talk. But my advice here is identify what needs to be done by the role. Define exactly the type of person and capabilities that needs to be hired based on that, and then hire that person only. What I mean by that is as you're interviewing people, don't kind of see like, maybe this person could do that, or maybe this person could do that. Be very honest with yourself and hire those specific capabilities. And if you can, if you're having a hard time finding that unicorn, outsource if you need to. But my advice here, if you're outsourcing, even if you plan on doing that into perpetuity, build out a plan of self-sustainability and understand what that looks like financially, because I don't know anything about finance. I mean, ask my wife, but like one of the lessons that I've learned is that position that in a way of how it's going to affect your bottom line alleviates a lot of conversations that might be more difficult in the future if you have to justify that retroactively. Process, create repeatable processes. Use known standards or frameworks. I mentioned the CSF. I think Dan mentioned OpenSAM, obviously the top 10, but also regulatory compliance frameworks. If you're taking payment cards, if you're dealing with PHI, PCI DSS, HIPAA, stuff like that, identify where you're missing and then build to that. And don't do it halfway, meaning like if it's just a check the box methodology, it's going to blow up in your face because, I mean, maybe if you're only able to do it halfway, it's because it's not an optimized process and you need to add into the mix some technology. I feel this should be the last option for solving problems. I don't think you should use technology to look for problems like what we oftentimes see with SOAR. And again, not being a developer is just not something I lead with. But then bottom line here would be just forget everything that I said, because if you know of people, process, or technology that works 10 times out of 10, lead with that. A great example would be Rapid7's Nexpose or IVM, not a paid shill, but like it's something that I'm very experienced with. The team that I was hiring had experience with, so we knew that it wasn't going to be an impediment. It was going to be a force multiplier as we rolled that out. Okay, I know I'm close on time, but a couple of the final lessons learned that I'll impart to you is that every company struggles with the following challenges. And it's funny because Dan, I don't know if Dan's still in here, he mentioned the quote, now every company is a software company. Satya Nadella actually didn't say that. He was quoted in an article, well, he did say that, but he didn't come up with it. He was quoted in an article that people grabbed that from. But that was actually coined by a Forbes journalist about 8 years prior to him. One of the examples that they used was pretty interesting. It's kind of getting out my sphere of influence, but around the time advancements in like energy tech, there are a lot of facets kind of converging at once. Compute miniaturization, everyone had a laptop at the time, probably contributed to it. But a company developed a $70,000 mobile instrument that allowed you to measure gas concentration around energy producers. Whereas before this, that capability was only in the hands of the energy producers themselves. So as you can imagine, not every company was just leaping at the opportunity to go spend a bunch of money on untrusted tech that would just tell them that they then needed to spend more money, but most did because they understood the calculus at hand. They understood that if they didn't just embrace this technology and use it and at least experiment with it and explore it, they knew that someone likely would. And if they were wrong, it could spell the end of their industry. Well, why am I saying this? This is not a setup for a fart joke, I promise. You can draw a parallel to security. There's a lot of effort still in 2022 of moving to the cloud, which is crazy, but there's still a lot of businesses that are not embracing comprehensive cloud security. Not everyone's paying for the $70,000 gas leakage tool, and like I said, taking that comprehensive approach to cloud security. But think about how reliant you are on cloud services. I'm sure everyone here utilizes some sort of cloud-based payment processor, right? Well, think about if that went down for just some sort of random issue, it would cause panic. But if that information was if that system was compromised and that information was used against you, I mean, that could level a company depending on how resilient they are. So the point being here is every business needs to understand that due to their reliance on the technology, you need to also protect it. If we don't monitor for our own gas leakages, someone absolutely will. All right, I know I'm short on time. Just a couple other things. Nobody talks, despite this never working. Companies continue to work in silos. So like I said talking about in areas of broader impact earlier, communicate why you're doing things, not just, hey, this is prohibited, it's against policy, but actually take the time to explain why these things exist. EDR everywhere is a blessing and a curse. Would I do it differently the next time? Maybe. It stopped a ton of attacks, but it also produced a ton of work. So also dealing with the vendor was a headache. But my point here, understand how much work is going to be involved and factor that into the total cost of ownership, just to see if the juice is going to be worth the squeeze of putting this on every internet-connected app out there, endpoint out there. Again, I think R&D would just operate with zero security if left unchecked, but you need to make sure that security is worked into the total cost of ownership of anything that you're trying to produce. If you don't, security will always be one of the first things that is clipped out. And finally, I'd say that defensibility is key. You're not always going to make the right decision every single time, but you can at least create processes that allow you to make the right decision given the information available at the time. Because, by the way, making a wrong decision, I believe, is better than making no decision, because at least that gets you to the right decision quicker. One of the product teams wanted to develop a tool that basically just had RDP open to the internet, just straight up. And so I just said, hold the phone. We don't do that in 2022 anymore. And we had to talk about Bastion hosts and kind of exploring, kind of a step in the right direction. I'm not sure how meaty that story is going to be for you, but the amount of resistance that I had in the reasoning behind opening up fucking RDP to the internet was mind blowing. I was just like, what are you talking about? But I would imagine working for a state agency, you at least have some regulatory compliance or some standards to refer to. But yeah, they still don't listen. They're standards. That's right. Embedded resistance. Yeah. Well, and that was a lot of, because I came in late. I came in like, well, we've always done it this way, and we're always going to continue doing it this way, Mr. Department of No. But when things started to hit the fan, the tide changed a little bit. Great question. Yeah, sorry, I don't have anything more compelling for you. Any other questions? If we run out of security questions, we can move on to Star Trek: The Next Generation. I'll take any one of you.
You said earlier that one of your quick wins was a 24-hour critical response. How did that kind of go? Or when you got those responses, what did they look like?
Okay. So the question is, 24-hour critical response, what did that look like? I mean, again, there was no SLA on when they were going to respond to things. And if we're being honest, there wasn't really a healthy communication of, hey, we're finding things, can you fix them? So when we would communicate issues to them, a list of vulnerabilities we found, it was just more of like we're going to have to balance this with product releases, and we're going to have to, we'll have a meeting about this, and we'll get back to you on when we're going to fix, Heartbleed or something like that. I mean, not like that's a specific instance. I can neither confirm nor deny that Heartbleed existed in that environment, but it was stuff like that. It was just, it helped us. It helped us force a measure of at least a response within 24 hours, and then we could talk about how long mitigation was going to look like for reasons I can't really get into.
So you just mentioned TNG. Have you ever brought up the concept of Lars doing account takeover or user impersonation, and what mitigating controls would have prevented that?
I think you just wrote my next talk. No, but that's fantastic. That's really good, because I actually always talk a bunch of shit about Star Trek: The Next Generation, but I've never worked it into one of my talks. Thank you for creating that. No, that's perfect. Any other questions? One more. All right.
Yeah. So you also said that you were externally communicating a lot of your progress. What kind of forums were you doing that on? How did you get buy-in to kind of make that process work?
Yeah, great question. So as many mediums as possible. The obvious one is email, but also we would communicate out on Slack. We would host regular security lunch and learns. We were predominantly remote at the time, so we'd send out Grubhub $40 gift cards, get people to show up. No, seriously, I mean, we were absolutely playing to our audience. But those helped out a lot. Also, when we got to actually tracking our metrics, working with our business partners and understanding how to display, time to resolution metrics and effectiveness, risk reduction, stuff like that. But a good point there would be to lean on your external, or lean on your partners in other organizations, because left to our own devices, it'd be like MS Paint, the Log4Shell logos that you saw in Dan's presentation. But yeah, I would say the answer to that is as many forums as possible. All right.
Sort of following up to that question.
That's enough time. We got to go for the next one. I got to get some set up. Sorry, he's got a limited time here.
You hate me.
All good. Thanks so much for your time, folks. I had a blast. See you next time.